Hi everyone. I would love to have more time to devote to this discussion of morality or any other, to be honest. I'm frustrated. I have to say I'm frustrated. I really wish I had more time to respond to comments. Frater, I apologize. I have not been able to give you a more thorough response to your comments. I do value everyone's time in responding, and I wish I had more time to devote to it. I don't want to belabor that point too much, but I just want you all to know I wish, and I'm frustrated to that extent. I wanted to take a moment and respond to a few comments that were left on my last couple of uploads and clarify a few things. I think it's important because I don't want to get the conversation to get bogged down in a lack of clarity or a misinterpretation of something that I'm saying, or me misinterpreting something someone else is saying. And also, when certain points that are made that are really valid, I think it's important to bring those to light for everyone who hasn't maybe happened to read a particular comment. So I'm foregoing lunch. I can imagine I'm going to have I'm foreseeing some indigestion here because I'm going to eat on the run after making this video. Some have issued some concerns that some of the terminology I'm using I'm not being accurate enough or clear enough with, or that I'm conflating words. T.S. Dave in particular has, as well as John F. McDropout. And so I wanted to just go ahead and, after however many videos it's been in this series, actually define my terms. Whoops. So T.S. David suggested that I'm conflating objective and universal. That was sort of his main objection. And so, to be clear on those, when I use the term objective, I mean that which exists independent of any particular person's beliefs or preferences, that sort of thing. And if I take that a step further to objective morality, that means it doesn't exist independent of any particular moral agent's thoughts or values or beliefs on the subject, but it does not exist outside of moral agency. In other words, if all moral agents disappeared, thered be no such thing as morality. It is a concept, so it's dependent on there being people who can conceptualize it. When I speak of universal, I'm speaking of that which should be applied to everyone equally. That's what I mean by universal. So if I speak of universal morality, what I'm saying is there can't be any exceptions made for this guy or that guy. That in other words, if rape is wrong, it's rape is wrong for everyone. And when I say absolute, I mean unchanging and without exception. So to say rape is wrong means there's no possible scenario in which rape is right. And when I say wrong, I mean morally abhorrent, not incorrect. That, in the same way, obviously 2 + 2 = 5 is incorrect. When I use the term subjective, of course, I think everyone kind of understands that is dependent on one individual's specific values or beliefs, that sort of thing. It's an internal value judgment. When I use the term moral relativism, there are a few different aspects of moral relativism. And I would say that the reason that I've kind of used moral relativism and subjective morality interchangeably is, keep in mind, moral relativism is dependent on morality being subjective, right? Moral relativism wouldn't really make any sense if there were such a thing as an objective moral standard. So moral relativism is dependent on subjective morality, and it basically can be culturally dependent or situationally dependent, I think. There may be other aspects of moral relativism I'm not thinking of at the moment, but in other words, certain cultures have different moral philosophies, and we may actually envision certain instances where there might be a different moral ought, for lack of a better term, than in, say, another situation. So that would be morally relative. And really, if you think of in terms of subjective morality, moral relativism can't just be cultural. It could be any grouping of peoples or even individuals. You might say that guy has different morals relative to another. And so that's what I mean when I speak of moral relativism. Now, John F. McDropout had suggested that he didn't like the way I was using the term objective and suggested the term intersubjective, which I think would sort of mean, as he said, an intersubjective agreement on a certain idea or concept. Now, to suggest that I'm using the wrong word for what I mean, and to suggest that intersubjective would be a better term, I think is to kind of smuggle his conclusion into my argument, right? And I mean, I think it's just kind of cute, and so that's fine. But intersubjective does not replace objective in the way that I'm framing my argument. However, there is, I think, value in digesting this term of intersubjectivity versus just the purely subjective. And this gets to some other objections that were raised as well. I think it was T.S. Dave, but I could be wrong, so apologize if I'm wrong there, who objected to me suggesting that there are 7 billion moral sets of moral ethics out there. 7 billion individual sets of moral ideas. That we have these sort of vague groupings of people, right? You know, Western civilization and Eastern civilization, and then historic, etc., etc. And so there aren't really 7 billion. When I was sort of saying that if your morality is truly subjective, that you're cloaking it in this absolute speak to make it sound as though it's not just 1/7 billionth of the opinions on the planet. Now, I understand his objection, and I think this speaks towards this intersubjective agreement that John F. McDropout was alluding to. And that is that we have these groupings of people and we have some agreement in general amongst them, this intersubjective agreement on the prohibition against rape, for instance. That's one of the easiest ones, because that, you know, that prohibition is if you have that, you know, that moral precept in your mind, it's a lot more than just 1/7 billionth of the planet that thinks that, right? And I appreciate that. I think that's a valid point. In some ways, for my argument, it doesn't have that much impact, but I can appreciate what you're saying there, and I think that speaks towards this intersubjectivity. And I think there's value in that to a degree. However, if morality is truly objective, it doesn't lend us much, right? And there's several arguments that I'm going to try and put into one sort of thought experiment here. And so there's that, there's this intersubjectivity and the objection that, you know, there's not 7 billion moral arguments. There's, you know, maybe there's 7. Like you could, especially, you know, keep in mind, I'm only talking about the moral heavyweight issues, rape, murder, theft, you know, crimes against property, considering personhood as the first property, right? Those are the issues that I'm speaking of. There you know, maybe there's 7 moral arguments that would combine those things together, right? It was DJ Sichuan who had said, I think for the same reason that when we watch a monster truck show, we don't shout out, holy shit, I think that smash was awesome. What we say is, that was awesome. I think you're overanalyzing things a bit. And I made the response to DJ Sichuan that they're not quite the same thing. There's you know, one is sort of unimportant, and the other, ethics, is of the utmost importance. I mean, it has to do with how we interact with one another and how we govern ourselves. So, you know, I think language is a lot more important when you're dealing with things like that. But there's something smuggled in there. I'll get to that in a moment. And so I mentioned that. And he said, no, my point was, I think that smash was huge as opposed to that smash was huge. Get it? You're saying we should use proper subjective language, but it sounds awkward. Same with, I think rape is wrong as opposed to rape is wrong. That's what I meant by overanalyzing. Do you say, I think, before statements? Well, again, the importance of the situation, I think, is critical there. Ethics are of the utmost importance. Watching a monster truck race and commenting on what you think about it is of a lot less importance. But more importantly than that, that smash was awesome, or that sound was loud. These are already relative statements. Rape is wrong is an absolute statement. We don't need to say, I think that sound was loud, because implicit in the term loud is that loud is relative. Loud according to what? Loud compared to what? Someone who had been exposed to a improvised explosive device in Iraq might have a different interpretation or a relative scale for loud than a librarian, right? Or a forest ranger who spends all his time out in the wilderness where it's quiet. And we know this, that loud is a relative term. Wrong is only relative to its opposite, really, which is right, or correct and incorrect, morally abhorrent or morally acceptable, right? So you're conflating these kind of statements, you know, one that's absolute speak and another one that's relative right out of the gate. Also, when it comes to issues of ethics, of course, our language needs to be precise because we're dealing with important issues for the very same reason that it's treated differently legally when someone says, "I wish you were dead," or someone says, "I am going to kill you." We recognize the differences in those statements. It's very difficult to charge someone with uttering a threat if they just say, "I wish you were dead." One is talking about something, you know, that they wish would happen, and the other one is making something direct. It's more of an absolute statement of their intention and their, you know, the fact that they're going to act on that. And so I still think it's very important that our language be specific, and I think the reason that it's not is because we're wishing to smuggle in the aura of objectivity and absoluteness when we say rape is wrong, when we really mean I think rape is wrong. And you haven't addressed the communication problem because arguably you are in the minority. So when you say rape is wrong, how do you actually expect to communicate what you really mean to the majority of people who believe that rape is objectively wrong? Arguably, of course, those would be Christians or the religious among us. However, you are still in the minority. It would be silly, I think, to go around. I mean, you know, we have this frustration with people who come from other countries and don't completely learn our language, right? Or they, you know, we call a customer service line and they don't speak our language properly. We sort of say, "Hey, if you're going to come here, learn how to speak English," you know. Well, you are similarly in a minority, right? I think it's very important. I had said earlier that I was going to attempt to break down two arguments into a single thought experiment, and I can't remember what the second argument was. Forgive me. T.S. Dave had further said when we were talking about objective morality, he wonders what I would do if it turned out that objective morality did in fact exist and it disagreed with my moral standards. And I think it's a fabulous question. Really fabulous question. First of all, I would say that I would hope that I would wish to be moral regardless of my own personal feelings on it. But I think it illuminates a bit of a paradox in that my particular moral standards, for instance, are that rape is wrong, immoral. Murder is immoral, theft is immoral. So what if we found out objective standards actually exist and it was objectively true that rape is moral? It disagrees. It disagrees with my ethics. My ethics say that rape is immoral. What if objective moral standards were that rape is moral? This poses a paradox which I think illuminates a little bit of the problem or the solution, the problem with subjective morality and the solution to it, which is objective morality. Now, I can't take credit for this. These thoughts are not my own. This argument was put forth by Stefan Molyneux in his book, Universally Preferable Behavior. It's available, I think, for free as a book, as an ebook. I think you have to pay for it if it's paperback or whatever, but it's also available as a YouTube video. I'll link it below. I have been reluctant to do so to this point for several reasons, but I think it's important, obviously, to give credit where credit is due, that he provides this sort of argument that if we reverse our sort of intuitive moral ideas like rape, murder, theft are suddenly moral, how does that work logically? Now, one would have to say that morality should be something that a person should be able to be moral in periods of inactivity. They should be able to be moral while they're sleeping, should be able to be moral in a coma. Okay? So if rape is moral, how does that work? How can I be moral? I can only be moral when I'm raping. I therefore am immoral when I'm sleeping or if I'm unconscious or at any point in time when I'm not raping someone. That poses a bit of a logical problem, right? It's also extremely difficult to universalize a concept like rape is moral, because in order for rape to be rape, people have to resist it. They have to not desire it. So not desiring rape is arguably possibly immoral if the act of rape is moral. Either way, I think it poses logical problems to try to universalize a principle like rape is moral. And so I think that lends towards objectivity, logically speaking. Now, the argument goes far beyond that, and I'm not here to make Stefan Molyneux's argument for him. I just wanted to refer to that because I think it's interesting in terms of someone suggesting, okay, what if there was objective morality? Because a lot of people have been asking me, well, what are your moral standards? Like it would matter if morality was really subjective, right? But if morality was truly objective and it disagreed with my personal moral standards, how do those disagreements actually pan out? How do those opposite moral rules work out in principle? I think it's interesting. Finally, I'll get to the thought experiment I was mentioning earlier. When it comes to intersubjective, I remember the other argument was the still the language argument, this using this awkwardness of saying, I think rape is wrong. And the continued adherence to there being any kind of subjective morality, including the intersubjective. Because the intersubjective relies on consensus, right, within a group. And of course, keep in mind, all groups are arbitrary, except maybe genetic ones. I mean, the nuclear family, you might not call an arbitrary group, but lots of other groups are arbitrary. Lines move, right? Countries change shape and form all the time, governments get overthrown, people change their grouping name, so groups are largely arbitrary. So if we think of this term of intersubjectivity, meaning general consensus, it's interesting to think about that in terms of how we argue for morality when situations change. So for instance, I'm sure probably a lot of you have seen this. It's kind of out there. This little information campaign that says, Islam is going to take over the world. It's pretty strong, I think, in the UK right now, where they're showing the birth rates of, sort of the Christian population and the birth rates of the Muslim population, and how that's going to change the makeup of the country at some point. So taking that a step further, imagine that, of course, at some point in Western countries, Muslims become the majority. And let's just say that they infiltrate the halls of government and they form also a majority of the population. And they start to make changes. Maybe they don't go as far as even trying to put Sharia law into effect or whatever, but they start making changes to individual laws and individual rights and freedoms. You've lost the intersubjective consensus there in that arbitrary grouping of people. And I wonder if people would then just succumb to the new intersubjective agreement. Or if they would argue that, for instance, murder is still wrong or rape is still wrong. Obviously I'm arguing for changes to law that would probably not take place under Sharia law. Maybe, we might consider it to be murder if a girl tries to go to school and somebody kills her. Or we might consider, other acts of Sharia law implementation to be murder rather than just killing. But once again, we get into this, what's the intersubjectivity of that? If you are then in the minority, you've lost that consensus. And I think what would be happening is in the halls of government and in the public space, the people who do not agree with the new intersubjective consensus would be saying, no, that's wrong. And they would be making arguments based on objective facts to make that point. The argument of intersubjectivity and consensus only works, I think, when you're in the majority, when you're part of that consensus. When you're not part of that consensus, then we are going to revert to even stronger absolute declarations of objective truths. So I think that's an interesting thought experiment. As always, I'd love to hear what you think. It's an interesting discussion, and it has been racking my brain. I really appreciate it. There's a lot of people who've corrected me on things, and I've submitted to those things in some of the comments, and I wish I could remember them all, because I'd like to give credit where credit's due, and I'd like to show my willingness to submit to those things when they're brought to my attention. And I just can't remember them all right now. I'm digging it anyway. It's been a lot of fun, and I really appreciate everyone, and I apologize once again for not being as responsive as I'd like to be. But there's some more food for thought. Let's chew on that. Thanks. Bye for now.